everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and just to start off, it is going to be another heavy hitter this week. And by that, I mean this episode is going to get a lot more personal, and quite honestly, this episode is more on the selfish side, as I really felt called to talk about this to also help me close a certain chapter in my life right now and really start new. And at the time of me recording this, we just wrapped up the Cancer new moon, so of course, everything is just kind of falling in line. And to be honest, I am a little nervous to talk about this just because I don't know if really many will follow it, but I think that maybe that's why I need to talk about it. We are going to be exploring the deep, deep world of toxic femininity, mother wounds, and how these shadows show up in witchcraft spaces, where we often idealize the divine feminine without addressing the very real wounds some of us carry. And personally, divine feminine made me feel almost alienated for quite a long time due to not only my own wounds and traumas, but while everyone else kind of seemed to be on this high, it was really just the whole archetype of it. So, this episode, no doubt, will come from a very personal space. I grew up with what I now recognize as pretty significant mother wounds and toxic feminine patterns that affected every aspect of my life, from my friendships to my relationship with my own body to really how I understood what it meant to be a woman. So, with that out of the way, I promise next time we are going to talk about a much more fun subject. So, if this is not your thing, please just join us back next time. So, what I've noticed in witchcraft communities and, well, communities really as a whole, is that we talk a lot about toxic masculinity, and rightfully so, but we rarely address the equally damaging patterns of toxic femininity. And there's this tendency to idealize anything labeled feminine or goddess energy without really acknowledging that the feminine, just like the masculine, has a shadow aspect that can cause real harm. And this isn't about male bashing by all means or saying femininity itself is toxic. This is about honestly examining the ways that patriarchal conditioning creates unhealthy feminine responses and behaviors that do get passed down through generations through our own mothers or mother figures within our lives. And more importantly, it's about healing these patterns so we can embody authentic and healthy feminine power. So, I'll also be sharing how working with Hekate as the honest, complicated mother figure has been crucial, really, to my own healing journey. Hecate holds a certain space within my own practice in my life. More recently, I think it's been about two years now. I want to say that I've been working with her. Um, but there's this full spectrum of feminine experience when you work with Hecate, including the difficult shadow aspects we'd rather not acknowledge. So let's dive into this conversation with compassion, honesty, and the understanding that healing these patterns serves not just ourselves, but it breaks cycles for future generations. All right, so maybe I should start by clarifying what toxic femininity actually is, or at least what I mean when I'm talking about it in this case. And there's no doubt around the confusion of it, or even maybe a sense of taboo, but it is not about femininity being toxic itself. I want to make that very, very clear. And it is certainly not about blaming women for patriarchal oppression. What I'm talking about is specific behavioral patterns and coping mechanisms that can develop under these, patriarchal conditionings that end up being harmful both to the person displaying them and to those around them. So these are often survival strategies that women develop when they don't have access to direct power or when they've been taught that certain forms of expression, like direct anger or clear boundaries, are, quote, unfeminine. So instead, the power gets expressed sideways through either manipulation, passive aggression, emotional vitality, or other indirect means. And honestly, this can stem from a cycle of other feminine wounds directly caused by other women or just other circumstances in general. I'm going to say the word patriarchal here quite a bit, but it's not entirely what I mean. And I know that's not where it all stems from. But one of the most common manifestations is this passive aggressive communication. Instead of saying directly what we need or feel, we hint, we sulk, we expect others to read our minds, and then we punish them when they inevitably fail to meet expectations that never even knew existed. I learned that this pattern existed so early that for years, I didn't even realize that there were other ways to communicate needs and boundaries just by seeing it displayed from a young age. So then there's this emotional volatility used as a control mechanism. This isn't about having big emotions. Emotions are natural and healthy. I'm talking about weaponizing emotional reactions to manipulate situations or avoid accountability. And, it's the tears that come out whenever someone tries to address some harmful behavior or the dramatic emotional outbursts that shut down any possibility of productive conversation. And victim mentality is another big one. This goes beyond recognizing when you've been genuinely harmed or oppressed, which is important and valid. But toxic victim mentality is when someone chronically positions themselves as helpless and everyone else as responsible for their well being and happiness. It's learned helplessness as a lifestyle where personal agency and responsibility get completely abdicated. So, competitive jealousy and sabotage between women is another manifestation that I think most of us have encountered. If you haven't encountered it, I don't know where you live because I want to live there. But instead of supporting other women's success, there's this underlying belief that there's only room for one woman to succeed. And I do know that this is changing just with the newer generations, but this still lingers within individual households. And so there's this threat, other women become these threats to be undermined rather than potential allies. And this shows up as gossip meant to damage reputations, withholding support or opportunities, or just really the classic mean girl dynamic that unfortunately does not always end in high school. So, using femininity as a weapon is another pattern. Weaponizing things like sexuality, emotional labor, or even gender expectations to manipulate situations. This might look like using sex or affection as rewards and punishments, or performing helplessness to avoid taking responsibility, or leveraging societal expectations about how men, quote, should treat women to manipulate outcomes and also conditional love. This is particularly damaging when it comes from mothers or maternal figures. This is love that comes with strings attached. You're only lovable when you're meeting certain expectations, behaving in certain ways, or fulfilling certain roles. The love gets withdrawn whenever you step outside the approved boundaries, creating this chronic anxiety and people pleasing patterns. And then there's perfectionism and impossible standards both for yourself and for others. This might show up as never feeling good enough, no matter what you accomplish, or constantly criticizing others for not meeting unrealistic expectations. Its standards are so high that they guarantee failure and ongoing dissatisfaction. So, really, what's crucial to understand here is that these patterns don't develop in a vacuum. They're responses to living in systems where women don't have access to direct power, where authentic female expression is punished or suppressed, where women are taught to compete with each other for male attention and approval rather than building each other up. And patriarchy hasn't just oppressed women, it taught women to oppress themselves and each other in very specific ways. When you can't express anger directly, it comes out as passive aggression. And boy, do I fucking hate passive aggression. I definitely fall under the more just straight aggressive type rather than the passive aggression. But this shows up quite a lot. When you can't access, economic independence, you might learn to use maybe sexuality or emotional manipulation to get your needs met. And when you're taught that other women are competition rather than allies, you learn to see female relationships as inherently unstable and threatening. So these toxic patterns are different from toxic masculinity, but they are equally as damaging. While toxic masculinity, often shows up as an overt aggression, dominance, and emotional suppression, toxic femininity tends to be more covert, expressed through manipulation, emotional volatility, indirect aggression, and the use of victimhood as power. Understanding these patterns isn't about judging or blaming women who display them. Most of us learn these strategies as children when we really had no other options. They are or were survival mechanisms that helped navigate difficult or dangerous situations. The problem is when these childhood survival strategies become adult operating systems that damage our relationships and keep us stuck in cycles of dysfunction. So, for those of us in witchcraft communities, recognizing these patterns becomes especially important because spiritual practices can either perpetuate these toxic dynamics or help us transform them. Are we using our spirituality to avoid taking responsibility for our behavior? Are we spiritually bypassing our way around difficult emotional work? Are we creating magical communities that replicate the same unhealthy dynamics that maybe we grew up in? And the goal isn't to shame anyone for having learned these patterns, but to create awareness so we can consciously choose different ways of being. Because when we heal these tendencies in ourselves, we're not just improving our own lives, we're breaking generational cycles and modeling healthier ways of embodying feminine power for everyone around us. So now I think it's time to get really honest with you about my own experience. Because I think sometimes hearing someone else's story helps us recognize patterns in our own lives that we might have normalized or dismissed as just how things were. So, in my own household growing up, I was raised by a mother who embodied quite a few of these toxic feminine patterns. As I have grown in my craft, in psychology, in shadow work, and own self discovery, I started to realize not just the obvious wounds, but even later how deeply some of these scars lied and how it affected my life and even some of the choices that I may have made along the way so far, really without even noticing. And these dynamics had shaped every aspect of my life somehow, from how I related to other women, to my own sense of self worth, to my understanding of what it really meant to be female. And the most damaging pattern was the victim mentality. There was a constant flow of drama, gossip, and fighting while, she displayed herself as the victim. She was always the creator. She was addicted to chaos because it either meant she was the center of attention and it was validating to feel important. And, also it was a pass for taking responsibility for her own choices. Obviously, this created an environment where our household revolved around crisis. I learned that my role was to listen to complaints and to process her constant emotional upheavals, especially because I've always been um, emotionally sensitive to other energies. Obviously, I mean, becoming a witch or, finding that within myself from a very young age. So yeah, and I just want to make it clear, don't get me wrong, I have learned to process and continue to learn to process the multiple avenues where most of my personal shadows draw from. And it's not just all from my mother or my mother wound, but I digress. I digress. I lived with a woman who was a chronic gossiper. Not just casual comments about people, but vicious, destructive talk that went in circles, even when there was no more to say. Sharing secrets, spreading rumors is a constant activity. Even feeling that weapon aimed at me sometimes as a growing child and a teenager. Particularly, this affected the way that I made friends with other women and girls. I grew up listening to a constant stream of negativity, betrayals, and seeing how unstable these quote friendships were. It made me realize I wanted no part of it. So naturally, I never really made any friends and really kept to myself socially most of the time. But perhaps what was, the most damaging was how she would actively create drama when things were peaceful. If there wasn't a crisis happening, she would find a way to stir the pot and manufacture one. She couldn't tolerate calm or stability because then she wasn't the center of attention. And this might look like bringing up old grievances just when everyone was starting to get along, or starting fights, uh, either with my dad or at family gatherings, or creating conflict between other people by sharing things that they had said about each other. She was like this black hole of emotional energy that sucked everyone around her into chaos and dysfunction. So, as a child, this was exhausting and confusing. I never knew when the next eruption was coming. Just when I thought things were stable and safe, she'd blow up some situation and drag everyone into this emotional tornado. And I eventually learned to be hypervigilant, constantly scanning for signs that another drama was about to unfold. And what made this even more toxic was her complete inability to take responsibility for her role in these patterns. In her mind, she was always the victim of other people's bad behavior. She never acknowledged that she was the common denominator in all of these conflicts, and that her gossiping and the drama creation were pushing people away and creating the very rejection that she claimed to be experiencing. So, I learned that my emotional needs, my school problems, my social struggles, none of that got attention because she was too consumed with her own manufactured crises. I learned that my job was to listen, to validate, and to even support her through, an endless cycle of self-created drama. And there was no space for me to be a child with my own needs and feelings. So when someone is constantly positioning themselves as the wronged party, there's no space for mutual vulnerability or a genuine connection. There is no reciprocity, no curiosity about other people's experiences, and no capacity to truly see or support anyone else. This recognition process was gradual and honestly pretty painful for years. I thought maybe this is just how families worked. And I remember the first time I was around a mother who actually centered her children's needs instead of her own drama, who listened more than she talked, who created stability instead of chaos. And it was like seeing a completely different species of human being at first. It was kind of one of those things where I don't know that this kind of mothering existed. It really was something that I saw in the movies or didn't really think was real because I never saw it. So, a lot of shadow work should be ultimately put back on ourselves. And when we choose to integrate, and particularly with the mother wounds, has involved learning to recognize when, you're slipping into similar patterns. You can ask yourself, am I creating a drama when things are too peaceful? Am I gossiping about people in ways that damage relationships? Am I using other people as emotional dumping grounds instead of doing my own work? So, on one hand, I had this intense mother wound that affected me in certain ways, though I can recognize that I have been affected in ways of having a very, very masculine presence in my life as well. So I got a little nice mix of both. But anyways, truly what made, this journey of healing from this possible was spirituality and leaning into the craft. While I have always been called to the very folky and spellcrafty ways of magic, that's something that has always existed within me. I constantly came back to the psychology of witchcraft and spirituality to heal myself. And this is really sad to say, but therapy was really never an option when I was growing up. I didn't have my own consent. I was too young. I didn't have money. And, it was just completely pushed aside. So I turned to what I could control. And that was, my own self-discovery and picking at my own brain. I was beginning shadow work so early without even knowing what it was, purely from just the urge of wanting to be better, to get away from where I came and the fear of becoming that very thing. I already had this sense of how do I fix this so I do not become that? And later within my craft, as I began to discover Hekate, or her discovering me, I guess, I realized one of the roles that she began to play in my life. So while a lot of people recognize other deities for this kind of work, I could say that Hekate kind of fell into it for me, or at least the work I was doing with her more or less became it naturally. It became absolutely transformational, and Hecate is often referred to as a triple goddess. Obviously, she is much, much more than that. She has hundreds and hundreds of epithets, and she is not an idealized version of these aspects that we often see portrayed. Her maiden aspect isn't innocent and pure. She's fierce and independent and a survivor. Her mother aspect isn't just nurturing, she is protective in ways that can be terrifying, but her intention is always on you and your own well being and growth. If there's one major thing that I've learned from Hecate is she pushes you the fuck out of the nest to fly. She does not wish for the ground to get any closer. She, doesn't magically make a puddle of water appear below just in case you fall. She will look you in the eyes and yeet you off that shit because she knows that is what needs to happen for us and for our growth. Her crone aspect doesn't just offer wisdom, she reveals truths that you buried and puts the tools and the weapons in your hands to use them. Hecate specializes in liminal moments, those threshold times when you have to choose which direction to go. And healing from toxic family patterns is really the ultimate crossroads moment. You can continue repeating the cycles you inherited, or you can choose to break them. But the choice requires seeing clearly what those patterns actually are and taking responsibility for your role in perpetuating them. Hecate holds the keys. She can unlock doors, but she can also lock them. So, in my healing work, she has helped me unlock the patterns I needed to understand and transform while helping me lock the door on behaviors and mindsets that no longer served me. One of the first things Hecate taught me was the difference between being victimized and choosing to remain a victim. Yes, I had genuinely been harmed by my mother's toxic patterns. That was real and it deserved acknowledgement and compassion. But at some point, I had to stop using that harm as an excuse for maybe some dysfunctional behavior that I was displaying. Naturally, I always knew there was a way out and I wanted to do something about it. And Hecate became that support system for me to do it. Working with her torchbearer aspect was powerful for illuminating patterns I couldn't see clearly. She would literally shine light into, the shadows of my psyche and show me when I was replicating toxic behaviors I thought I had rejected. For me personally, it was never really a direct replication. I have experienced something where these traumas were almost like shapeshifters and a lot harder to seek out for me. I was quite good at not doing the obvious thing and just repeating what I saw and experienced, but more secretively, like almost, I remember there was one moment where, why do I not have many female friends? Why do I feel like an outlier here? I never apologized for being different or walking to the beat of my own drum. And while, yes, that meant being a little isolated, but as an adult, it stuck with me. So I recognized my caution and realized that it was the thing that was holding me back. I do not want to risk myself by, rolling the dice and having that feeling come back as a child maybe happen again. That is, the kind of thing that Hecate has illuminated for me. She illuminated the path, but I have to be the one to walk it, and she is the guide. So, as the psychopomp and as the guide between worlds, Hecate helped me navigate the transition from who I had been to who I was becoming. Healing from family drama involves a kind of death and rebirth. You have to let parts of your identity die, and the parts that were built around dysfunction that only knew how to exist in chaos and conflict. And then you have to birth new parts of yourself that can thrive in health and stability. One thing I will share while doing a trance work with Hecate, it was very, very intense. It was like a rebirth situation, and I crawled into the mouth of a giant python, and its muscles worked and squeezed, and really, I was quite claustrophobic at first. And sorry, this is kind of violent, so if you get squeamish, maybe skip a little bit, but basically, its muscles worked and squeezed my body, and all my bones began to break, and it was being slowly digested and becoming nothing, nothing but my heart. And after being regurgitated, literally, and just as my heart, I began to rebuild. every cell, bone, vein, and then the blood flowed through my body again, but entirely new and remade. So, to say the least, this process is intimidating at times because healing is lonely, but it's worth it. Many people are so afraid of loneliness that they never choose to heal. And working with Hekate for mother wound healing is that she models a completely different kind of feminine power. She's not manipulative or passive aggressive. She's direct. She's not a victim. She's sovereign. And she doesn't create drama. She cuts through illusion to get to truth. She doesn't gossip or tear others down. She protects what she cares about and destroys what threatens it. Mirror work with Hecate was probably the most challenging, but also very transformative practice that I've done. I would stand before a mirror and ask her to help me see myself clearly, not through the lens of my trauma or my ego's self protection, but as I actually was. This meant seeing both my wounds and my strength, both my victimization and my agency, both the patterns I had inherited and my power to choose differently. And she also taught me about healthy anger. In toxic feminine patterns, anger either gets suppressed until it explodes destructively, or it gets expressed through passive aggression and manipulation. And honestly, I'm just not down for that shit. So, Hecate showed me that anger could be clean instead of bottling it up like I would, and clear force for protection and boundary setting, that I could be angry about injustice, including the injustice I had experienced, without letting that anger consume me or turn me into someone harmful. Perhaps most importantly, Hecate helped me understand that healing the mother wound doesn't mean finding a replacement mother figure who will give you all the love and nurturing you didn't receive. It means developing your own internal capacity for self mothering, learning to give yourself the protection, the guidance, and unconditional love that you needed but didn't receive. And she taught me to mother myself in a way that I had needed to be mothered, with fierce protection, honest communication, clear boundaries, and love that wasn't conditional on my behavior or performance. This internal reparenting work was more healing than any external relationship could have been because it meant I was no longer dependent on others to meet needs that only I could truly fulfill. So working with Hecate also helped, me understand that breaking generational patterns is actually a form of ancestor work. And every time that I chose a healthier response than what I had learned, I was healing not just myself, but my entire lineage. I was stopping toxic patterns from being passed to future generations. This gave my personal healing work a much larger sense of purpose and meaning, and the transformation hasn't been linear or easy. There are still times, when I catch myself slipping into old patterns, but now I have the awareness and tools to recognize what's happening and to course correct. I have internalized Hecate's fierce love and honest guidance, so even when she's not explicitly present in my awareness, I can channel her energy and stay grounded in truth and personal responsibility. So, utilizing Hecatean work in your own practice on this specific area of healing and work can mean a lot of different things, especially on your own journey and what it means for you. The more you work with her, the more you begin to understand her entire embodiment is relevant, really everywhere. Like, literally, there's so many different boxes she could fit into. Obviously, there are a lot of correspondences, just in general, like practical correspondences to Hecate, but for this, I really liked to choose the tools that best fit my goal. Naturally, the snake came to me, but snakes are very transformative. They digest things slowly, they swallow things whole. You can work with the phosphoros epithet, which is the torches to illuminate and light the way. This particularly helps with certain areas of work needing to be brought to the light, to be looked at, to be worked at. And I think mostly when it comes to working certain shadows with Hecate, she tends to bring the things that you need to you. You just really have to be perceptive to it and open to whatever it might be, especially when you are looking at the parts of yourself that you don't want to look at. So, I want to talk about something that might make some people uncomfortable, and that is the toxic feminine patterns that we inherit from our families and our culture doesn't just disappear when we become witches. In fact, sometimes spiritual spaces can actually enable or amplify these behaviors because we wrap them in spiritual language that makes them harder to recognize and challenge. One of the biggest places I see this show up is in the idealization of divine femininity. Without any acknowledgement of the shadow aspects of feminine energy, there's this tendency in some witchcraft circles to treat anything labeled feminine as automatically good, pure, and healing. I know that's not entirely the case because dark goddesses are, dare I say, trending, but they were trending for quite a long time. The goddess is always loving, always nurturing, always supportive. Women are naturally more intuitive, more connected to nature, and more spiritual. But here's the thing: this isn't actually honoring the full spectrum of feminine power. It's creating another impossible standard that women have to live up to when you can only acknowledge the light aspects of femininity. All the shadow stuff goes underground where it festers and it gets expressed in toxic ways. I've seen spiritual communities where women are expected to constantly be supportive, endlessly patient, never angry or competitive or difficult, where expressing authentic emotions like frustration and disappointment or anger gets labeled as just negative energy. And that brings the whole group down. This is just another form of the same patriarchal conditioning that tells women to be nice above all else, dressed up in a spiritual language. So, the perfect witch mythology, social media has made this so much worse. Instagram witch culture creates this pressure to present yourself as this perfectly balanced, aesthetically pleasing, spiritually evolved being who never struggles or fails or has messy human moments. And your altar has to look perfect. Your spells always work. Your spiritual practice is consistent and beautiful and Instagram worthy. This performative spirituality is just another version of toxic perfectionism, just with crystals and candles instead of traditional markers of success. It creates the same anxiety, the same sense of never being good enough, the same constant comparison and competition. And yes, this all feeds into some sort of capitalism. I know that is a whole nother rabbit hole when it comes to the witchcraft space and overconsumption. But women and witches in general start to feel like they're not witch enough if their practice doesn't look like what they see online. And I've seen this manifest as spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid taking responsibility for harmful behavior, like, when someone causes harm and then says, everything happens for a reason, or this was meant to teach you a lesson, or when someone refuses to address their impact on others because I'm just being authentic to my truth. So I think it's smart for us to talk about these things and recognize the harmful patterns that lie underneath it. And so, also, witch wars in community drama. The witch community online is notorious for drama. That is why I stick to Spotify right now. And actually, I am going to start posting on my Instagram more, but don't hold me to it because we'll see. And so much as follows: the classic toxic feminine patterns, the passive aggressive subtweets, the call out posts that are really about personal conflict but get framed as social justice, the way information and rumors spread through the community like wildfire. We've watched which influencers tear each other down through carefully worded posts that maintain plausible deniability. The whole I'm not naming names, but people in this community, it's really just the same gossiping and reputation destruction that happens in any toxic social group, just with witchcraft as the backdrop. And then there's the way some people use their trauma stories as weapons in conflicts. Don't get me wrong, sharing your experiences and having them validated is definitely important, but when someone brings up their trauma every time they're asked to take responsibility for their behavior, or when trauma becomes a way to shut down any criticism or accountability, that's victim mentality showing up in spiritual spaces. So, gatekeeping and real witch policing, another place I see toxic feminine patterns, also just toxic patterns, is in the gatekeeping around who counts as a real witch and what constitutes authentic practice. This often looks like older practitioners or those from certain traditions positioning themselves as the arbitrators of legitimacy and then using emotional manipulation to enforce their authority. And you know what? If you really want to see what's good, send your spirits to scout what the fuck is up and find out if that practitioner has the arsenal that they say they do. Sorry, not sorry. I've seen people use tears, hurt feelings, and claims of being attacked when their knowledge or approach is questioned, or they'll frame their gatekeeping as protecting the tradition or maintaining standards when really it's about controlling who gets access to knowledge and community. Obviously, there are closed practices, there's closed traditions, there's initiatory systems, and even spirit contracts where revealing what you have learned or are learning or just what you can share or not share is a thing. But usually, authentic practitioners make that part extremely clear and don't use it as a front to seem more advanced than they are. In my humble opinion and experience, advanced practitioners have absolutely no desire to make the scope of their magics known and continue to perform as humble students as we all are. So, victim spirituality. This is when people use their spiritual practice to maintain their identity as a victim rather than to empower themselves to create change. Every spell is about protection from others. Every divination reading is about what other people are doing to them. Every spiritual explanation for their problem centers on external forces, curses, psychic attacks, karmic debts from past lives. Now, obviously, energetic protection and dealing with harmful people are legitimate concerns, but when someone's entire spiritual practice revolves around being under attack and never includes self reflection about their role in creating their circumstances, that's victim mentality in spiritual clothing. I've seen people spend, years of protection work against the same toxic people instead of just setting boundaries and removing themselves from harmful situations. Because actually changing their circumstances would require taking responsibility and action, which feels scarier than remaining in victim mode and just complaining about it. The competitive healer in healing focused spiritual communities, I see toxic competition around who's done more work, who's more healed, who has overcome more trauma. There's this subtle hierarchy where people with the more dramatic healing stories get more attention and validation. And this creates incentives for people to either exaggerate their trauma or to resist actually healing because being in recovery becomes part of their identity and social capital. It also creates shame for people whose healing journey looks different or who might not have survived major trauma but still have very legitimate struggles. So, breaking these patterns in spiritual spaces, the first step is recognizing that spirituality doesn't automatically make us immune to toxic patterns. In fact, spiritual communities can sometimes enable these behaviors because we're reluctant to call out anything that gets dressed up in spiritual language. We need to create space for the full spectrum of human experience in our spiritual practices and communities. That means acknowledging that anger, competition, selfishness, and other, quote, negative emotions are natural parts of being human. It means holding people accountable for their behavior, regardless of how they frame it spiritually. It also means being honest about our patterns and motivations. When we catch ourselves gossiping about other practitioners or feeling competitive about someone else's spiritual experiences, or using our practice to avoid taking responsibility for our own actions, we need to name it and work with it instead of spiritualizing it away. The goal isn't to become perfect spiritual beings who never have messy human moments. I mean, I'm literally talking about mother wounds and toxic femininity. The goal is to become integrated human beings who can acknowledge and work with all aspects of ourselves, including the shadow parts that we've been taught to fear or reject. This is where the honest mother energy of Hekate becomes so valuable in community spaces. She doesn't enable dysfunction or allow people to hide behind spiritual bypassing. She demands the truth, accountability, and growth. When we embody that energy in our communities, we create spaces where people can be authentically human while still being held to healthy standards. So, after all this talk about toxic patterns and shadow work, let's talk about what healthy feminine energy actually looks like. Because the goal isn't to reject femininity or become afraid of feminine power. The goal is to reclaim authentic, integrated feminine energy that serves life instead of undermining it. So, healthy feminine energy is fierce and compassionate at the same time. It's the mother bear who will destroy anything that threatens her cubs, but who also nurtures and protects with incredible tenderness. It doesn't choose between strength and softness, it integrates both as needed. Real feminine power is direct and honest in communication, and it says what it needs clearly instead of dropping hints and expecting others to read minds. It sets boundaries without guilt and enforces them without drama. It can express anger cleanly when something is wrong instead of letting resentment build up and explode later. Healthy feminine energy is collaborative rather than competitive. It celebrates other women's success genuinely because it understands that there's enough space, enough success, and enough love for everyone. Builds others up instead of tearing them down, and it shares knowledge and resources instead of hoarding them. It's also about deeply grounding yourself in personal responsibility. Healthy feminine energy owns its mistakes, learns from them, and makes amends when necessary. It doesn't use victimhood as a way to avoid accountability. It acknowledges when it's been harmed without using that harm as an excuse to turn around and go harm others. So, in spiritual practice, healthy feminine energy honors the full spectrum of goddess archetypes. It works with the nurturing mother, but also the fierce protector, the wise crone, the wild huntress, the sexual goddess, the destroyer, and the transformer. It understands that positive and negative forces are both necessary for life and growth. This means working with anger as a sacred force for boundary, setting, and justice. It means embracing sexuality as a holy expression of life energy. It means honoring the death and the decomposition aspects of the cycle as much as the birth and growth aspects. And it means integrating shadow rather than projecting it onto others. This healthy way of expressing this energy in community looks like mutual support without enabling. It means holding space for each other's pain while also expecting each other to do their own work. And it means calling people in when they're acting harmfully rather than either ignoring it or attacking them. And it means creating circles where people can be vulnerable and authentic without fear of judgment or betrayal. In relationships, it means being supportive without being self-sacrificing. It, gives freely but also receives gracefully. And it nurtures others, but it doesn't forget to nurture itself. What I've learned through my own healing journey is that healthy feminine energy requires both inner work and outer expression. You have to heal the internal patterns that keep you stuck in toxic cycles, but also you have to practice embodying different ways of being in your actual relationships and communities. And this means taking risks. It means expressing your needs directly when you're afraid of conflict. It means setting boundaries when, people push back. And it means choosing authenticity over people pleasing when it makes others uncomfortable. It means being there and supporting other women and not seeing them as competition. So, working with Hekate has really taught me that this kind of integrated, sovereign feminine energy doesn't develop overnight. It's an ongoing practice of choosing growth over comfort and truth over convenience, authenticity over approval. It requires constantly examining your motivations and your behaviors to ensure that they're coming from a healthy place rather than an old conditioning. So, as we wrap up this conversation, I want to acknowledge how vulnerable and challenging this topic can be. I definitely shared more than I expected to, and I hope that's okay with everyone who's listening. For those of you who are listening who recognize your own story in what I've shared, please know that you're not alone. Mother wounds, toxic feminine patterns, and the struggle to find authentic ways of being yourself in this world, these are incredibly common experiences that affect millions. The first step is always recognition. You can't heal from what you can't see. And sometimes the hardest part is admitting that the person who was supposed to be this model of healthy feminine energy for you, maybe your mother, your grandmother, or other maternal figures, was herself operating from wounded parts and patterns that she then passed on to you. This doesn't mean vilifying these women or blaming them for, the damage that they didn't intentionally cause. And most often, they were doing their absolute best with the tools and understanding that they had. But it does mean getting honest about the impact of their patterns and taking responsibility for breaking the cycles that no longer serve. The healing journey is ongoing. There is not a finish line, no matter what anyone tells you. It does not exist, where you suddenly become a perfectly integrated person who never slips back into old patterns. But what you can develop is awareness, tools, and the ability to course correct when you notice yourself falling back into dysfunction. Working with deities like Hekate can be incredibly supportive in this process because they offer models of feminine power that don't fit into patriarchal categories of good or bad femininity. They show us what it looks like to be complex and multifaceted, beings who can be nurtured and fierce, loving and boundaried, supportive and challenging. This work isn't just personal, it's ancestral healing. And it's cultural transformation. Every time you choose authenticity over performance, direct communication over manipulation, mutual support over competition, you're contributing to a larger shift in how feminine energy expresses itself in the world. So be patient with yourself as you do this work. Celebrate the small victories when you catch yourself before falling into an old pattern, and forgive yourself when you slip up and recommit to growing. Surround yourself with people who support your healing and are doing their own work. And remember that breaking these cycles is one of the most powerful acts of magic that you can perform. So I want to thank all of you from the depths of my heart for joining me in this very honest and very vulnerable conversation. If this episode brought up difficult emotions or memories, please be gentle with yourself and seek support if you need it. I hope all of you who have listened through all the way found some sort of value somewhere in this episode, and always reach out if you feel called to. As always, wherever you are, may you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.